Okay, picture this. It's July 1940, and the geopolitical map of Europe, it's completely unrecognizable. Adolf Hitler's Germany has just swallowed up almost everything in its path. We're talking Austria, Poland, Norway, Belgium, Denmark, France, just gone. And down south, his ally Mussolini is running Italy. So at this exact moment, practically the whole continent is locked under Axis control. The Soviet Union, kept at arm's length by a temporary peace pact. Honestly, broadly speaking, looking at the map, there was literally only one opposing force left standing. Just one: Britain.
Okay, let's dive into this, because Hitler was absolutely convinced that with the rest of Europe completely subdued, Britain would just, fold, sign a peace treaty. He thought there was no way they'd risk their entire country against his massive, seemingly unstoppable military machine. But then Winston Churchill drops this iconic quote and just completely shatters that expectation. "We shall never surrender." Churchill made it crystal clear: no peace treaty, no compromise. They were going to fight on the landing grounds, the fields, the streets, you name it. And this absolute defiance, it forced Hitler's hand. He suddenly needed a whole new strategy for an island nation that he couldn't just, march his army into.
To understand how this all played out, we've got a clear roadmap for you today. 1. Britain stands alone. 2. The fatal Soviet pivot. 3. A global conflict. 4. The tides turn. 5. The fall of Germany. And finally, 6. Shaping the modern world. Let's get right into it. Section 1. Britain stands alone. Hitler's first roadblock. So because Britain is an island, Hitler had to plan an amphibious invasion, Operation Sea Lion. But to actually cross the water safely, he absolutely needed air superiority. And guys, the British were facing a total David versus Goliath reality here. When Hitler kicked off his aerial assault in July 1940, the German Luftwaffe came in swinging with about 2,600 aircraft. The British Royal Air Force? Just 700. That's almost a 4-to-1 disadvantage. The initial German game plan was to relentlessly bomb airfields and factories to cripple British defenses. It was an incredibly brutal fight right out of the gate, and the British took some really heavy hits. But then the whole dynamic shifted dramatically. On August 24, 1940, German pilots accidentally bombed civilians in London, sparking these massive fires. A deeply stunned Winston Churchill immediately retaliated by bombing Berlin. Well, Hitler was enraged. He totally abandoned his strategic military targets and basically said, just destroy London. So, on September 15th, over 1,000 German fighter jets and bombers completely darkened the sky. But here's the wild part. The drastically outmanned RAF, working with only about 630 aircraft at this point, intercepted them brilliantly. They brought down more than 60 Luftwaffe planes while losing just 29 of their own. So how on earth did such an overpowered force win? Honestly, it's because defending your literal right to exist creates an unmatched motivation for survival. This massive victory, what we now call Battle of Britain Day, handed Hitler his very first major loss of the war.
Section 2. The fatal Soviet pivot. Turning eyes east.
Fast forward to April 1941. The Axis powers had stretched their reach all the way across Eastern Europe. But instead of sticking around to finish off Britain, Hitler does something crazy. He pivots east to attack the Soviet Union, a country he literally already had a peace treaty with. Why? In a word, megalomania. The guy was entirely delusional with power. He deeply despised communists and convinced himself that capturing a massive prize like the Soviet Union was the only way Germany could become the undisputed #1 superpower on the planet. And actually, scratch that. It wasn't just hubris. This deeply ideological, entirely unnecessary decision to rip up that peace pact, it would go down his absolute most fatal error. Let's look at how this builds. On June 22, 1941, Hitler unleashes Operation Barbarossa. He splits his forces into 3 massive spearheads. You've got one group pushing north, straight toward Leningrad, right to Stalin's doorstep. The second group is aiming dead center for Moscow, and the third is tearing south down through Ukraine. Now, at first, his blitzkrieg strategy worked like a charm. It was devastating. They pushed 100 kilometers into Soviet territory in just 2 days. In a matter of weeks, they were sitting a mere 300 kilometers outside of Moscow. But then, the higher-ups started bickering. Disagreements between Hitler and his commanders actually paused the advance. And that delay pushed them right into the brutal October winter. And let me tell you, that delay was absolutely catastrophic for Germany. See, while the Germans definitely brought a massive technological edge to the table with 6,000 highly advanced tanks, the Soviets just had overwhelming numbers. We're talking 20,000 tanks.
But more importantly, that famous, brutal Russian winter set in, handing a huge advantage to the cold-weather-hardened Soviets. Plus, the Soviets cleverly signed a non-aggression treaty with Japan, which meant they could suddenly pull all these vital, experienced troops off their eastern border and hurl them at the Germans. Oh, and they also teamed up with Britain to secure a crucial supply pipeline through Iran, keeping this massive army fueled and ready to go. The supposedly unstoppable German advance literally just froze in the snow. Section 3. A global conflict. The scale expands. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that while Europe was absolutely freezing through the winter of 1941, events on the exact opposite side of the planet were about to blow the scale of this war wide open. Until now, the United States had basically been watching the chaos in Europe from afar, completely determined not to get dragged into another World War I situation. But Japan had been aggressively expanding its empire into places like Thailand and Cambodia. And then, in December 1941, they launched a totally unprovoked strike on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, killing over 2,300 Americans. That was it. America was done sitting on the sidelines. They declared war on Japan, officially jumping into World War II and completing the Allied Grand Alliance alongside the UK, the Soviet Union, and China. The whole shebang was truly global now. Section 4. The tides turn. Axis failures cascade. By mid-1942, we are looking at a conflict raging across multiple continents, and the dominoes are starting to fall for the Axis powers. Hitler's stubborn push into the southern Soviet Union triggered the Battle of Stalingrad, which, by the way, became the single deadliest battle of the entire war. By November 1942, that brutal winter struck again. The Germans had almost captured the whole city, but they got totally surrounded. By February 1943, 300,000 freezing German troops had no choice but to surrender. That was easily the biggest turning point of the war. Meanwhile, down in Italy, the people had had enough. Everyday civilians revolted, anti-fascist partisans, the folks who actually inspired that famous song Bella Ciao, executed the dictator, Mussolini. With momentum seriously shifting, Allied leaders Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill finally met up in Tehran in November 1943 to start planning the knockout punch. And that knockout punch began on June 6, 1944, a date you absolutely know, D-Day. Honestly, the sheer terrifying scale of this operation is almost hard to wrap your head around. Over 150,000 British, American, and Canadian soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy in France. Think about that for a second. This was the very first time British troops were back fighting the Germans on the actual ground since they were chased out of Dunkirk years earlier. This colossal invasion in the West was a total game changer. It fatally split Hitler's forces. He was already bleeding men and resources in the freezing East, and now he was facing a massive wall of Allied soldiers in the West. Hitler was officially trapped in a devastating two-front war. Section 5. The Fall of Germany. Hitler's empire collapses. From here, the collapse was rapid and it was absolute. See, when Hitler desperately yanked troops from the east to deal with D-Day, the Soviets capitalized immediately. They unleashed a massive counterattack. In just 2 months, the Soviet army chewed up 600 kilometers of ground, rolling through Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania. Meanwhile, the Allies are landing in southern France, and Yugoslavia is actually liberating itself. Hitler tried one final, desperate gamble in the Ardennes forest, what we call the Battle of the Bulge, but it completely failed. By the time the Big Three met at the Yalta Conference in February 1945, the writing was permanently on the wall. The Allies were literally inviting nations from all over the world, Venezuela, Turkey, Egypt, to declare war and join the winning side. Germany was getting violently squeezed from 3 sides, all while relentless Allied aerial bombings were crumbling once great cities, like Dresden, straight into dust. The human cost of this final collapse was, well, it's almost incomprehensible. Just look at this number on the screen, 30,000. During the final 4 months of the war, 30,000 was the staggering, agonizing daily death toll, every single day. And as Allied forces pushed deeper into German territory, the true nightmare of Hitler's regime came to light. They uncovered the unimaginable, horrific realities of the concentration camps, where hundreds of thousands of innocent Jews and other targeted groups had been systematically murdered. The sheer, terrifying weight of this human tragedy is just profoundly difficult to process. By April 1945, the Soviet army had entirely surrounded Berlin. On April 30th, finally accepting that total defeat was at his door, Hitler took his own life. On May 8th, Germany formally surrendered. But while Europe was finally breathing its first sigh of peace in years, the global conflict wasn't actually over. The Pacific theater dragged on for several more grueling, devastating months. Japan completely ignored an ultimatum to surrender in July. That standoff culminated in August 1945 when the United States dropped atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And that unprecedented destruction finally, decisively brought the entirety of World War II to a close. Section 6. Shaping the Modern World. A New Geopolitical Era. So the crucial point is really what happened next. After all that destruction, the world map had to be entirely rewritten. The literal ashes of 1945 forged the geopolitical reality that you and I live in right now. Borders were radically redrawn. Germany was sliced into east and west. Poland was recreated right out of former German territory. But more than just drawing lines on a map, world leaders realized they had to structurally guarantee this could never, ever happen again. So they formed the European Coal and Steel Committee. The goal? To economically glue historic enemies, like France and Germany, together through trade. And guess what? It worked brilliantly. It worked so well that it expanded to include Italy, Britain, and others, slowly erasing borders to build cooperation. Jump to the year 2000, and this framework officially became the European Union, which has absolutely successfully prevented another major European war to this very day. And zooming out to a global scale, the victorious Allies set up some massive institutional safeguards. In October 1945, the United Nations was born, built specifically to act as a global referee and prevent future world wars. Naturally, the core Allied countries took up permanent seats at the table. This was super quickly followed by the creation of the World Bank, the IMF, and NATO. These organizations weren't just random acronyms. They were meticulously designed to bind the entire world together, both economically and militarily. The idea was to create a web so tight that a conflict of this unbelievable magnitude could literally never repeat itself. Which leaves us with this final, really important thought to chew on. We go about our daily lives operating within a global framework that was entirely 100% shaped by the terrifying lessons of World War II. But as the decades roll by and living memory of that time begins to fade, we really have to ask ourselves, as we rely so heavily on institutions like the EU and the UN today, can these systems built right out of the ashes of 1945 truly continue to hold the peace in our rapidly changing, incredibly complex modern era? Thank you so much for joining me for this Explainer-focused Learners. Keep studying the past and always stay curious about the fragile stability of our world today.